Thank you for joining us for today's episode of The Real Spill, a podcast where I spill on all things multifamily advocacy and how we as industry professionals can work with our elected officials, stakeholders, and allies to bring about change for the rental housing industry. My guests are subject matter experts whose unique perspectives will help listeners understand how the issues impact them. Let's get into The Real Spill. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's episode of The Real Spill here on the Multifamily Media Network. I'm your host, Katie Spillers, and with me today is Michelle Gilbert. Welcome, Michelle.
Welcome. Thank you so much for having me.
So we've been looking to do this, and this has been a conversation we've been looking forward to having for a couple of months now.
Absolutely.
And Michelle, would you mind telling listeners a little bit about what it is that you do and kind of how we met?
Sure, absolutely. So I work for Safe Harbor. Of course, we are a local nonprofit dedicated to serving victims and survivors of domestic abuse. I've been with the agency for about 16 years now in various roles, from advocacy to the family advocacy director to now the director of housing and advocacy. So I've worked with survivors coming into shelter. I've worked with survivors in the area of prevention as well as housing, just all across the gamut.
Awesome. And one of the stakeholder groups that we work with is the Greenville Homeless Alliance, and we're both part of the Collaborate working group. So we met through trying to help end homelessness in our area.
Absolutely, which is such a huge challenge, for survivors of domestic abuse. And so I'm so very thankful for the work that we've been able to do and will do around that topic.
Yes, and we're just wrapping up 2024. This episode will air Friday, January the 3rd. So it'll be our first episode of the new year. But I know that the Homeless Alliance, we're going to be getting started early too in the month to work on the 2025 objectives to hopefully continue to just inch away at the problem that we're seeing here in the upstate.
Absolutely. And hopefully being able to influence that not only on a local and, on a state level, but also, on a national level. I think it's so important, especially now that we be a part of the bigger conversations.
100%. And you've done so much to help the victims and survivors of domestic abuse. When did you know that this was a calling for you, that this is what I want to spend my life's work doing?
I think, Katie, I've known all my life that I've wanted to help, people. A lot of people, when they were smaller, they collected animals. I tended to always bring people home that had various challenges, and needs. But I think, domestic abuse was a field that found me. It wasn't a field that I was looking for. I was actually working in mental health and addiction, and that's where I started and was pretty content there, and actually just stumbled upon a part-time opportunity and only planned to do this for just a little while just to make some extra money. And it was just so far left from, it was what I thought was so far left from what I was doing. I almost thought it would be a reprieve because it was something that I just really didn't understand. And I just could not make the connection of why, someone would stay. I think culturally, as a young Black woman, it went against everything that I had been taught, and then I think just a part of me just believed that the world just was not that cruel. So I didn't understand the horrors of domestic abuse. And so I started in a part-time position and found myself just really soaking it in and listening to the stories and seeing the faces and realizing that so many of the people that I worked with were like people that I've known my entire life. And I didn't really have, I think, the verbiage of domestic violence or domestic abuse or understanding the cycle of abuse, but I saw all the signs and I saw that even how they had manifested, in some of my early life experiences. So yes, I went in really naive, but as with all callings, I believe there's always a sense of humor, when you find out what your calling is, and found myself on the other end and really just embraced the whole field, from that as a listener and learner. And the more stories, the more people, the more impact. And I realized that so much of it intersected with all the work that I had thought was my calling, and that I had done for so long. So I kind of fumbled and entered into the field. Say all the time it found me, but I can't imagine doing anything else.
And you mentioned it not being as far as you thought from what you were doing before. Certain that there are stats out there somewhere, but that there's a correlation between addiction and domestic abuse and violence for likely both the abuser and the one being abused.
Absolutely. And we know certainly that addiction or mental illness is not the single factor, for domestic abuse, but it does make, or it can make the abuse, worse, and it can make situations, more complex. And we know that addiction certainly can be a coping skill, whenever domestic abuse or violence, is present. We also know that those that abuse, substances are more likely to be abusive, to their spouse. And again, I want to reiterate, it's not the single cause, but certainly it does exacerbate situations.
And seeing things the way that you've been able to see them since the time that you've been with Safe Harbor, and we were talking a little bit off camera about this too, that it takes so long for the person being abused to leave. Like we could absolutely know that someone is in a dangerous situation, and we all think, why don't they just leave? But I think there's a very complex reason.
Absolutely. And, I believe that. When I first came into the field, I really thought things were a lot simpler. Like you just leave, you go talk to your family. And I wasn't naive to think that everyone had the greatest support system. But, if someone was doing you wrong, after a while, you kind of packed up and you moved on. But it was throughout my experience, here at Safe Harbor and listening and being a part of so many stories that I realized that leaving is only one part of the puzzle. And unfortunately, it is also not the easiest part, nor is it the hardest part, right? So there are so many things that go well beyond just leaving an abusive relationship, leaving and then what? If you're a mother and you have children, what does that look like? Especially if there's no financial stability. One of the core tactics for domestic abuse long before any bruises, emerge is the isolation and the emotional abuse. So if you've been cut off from family, friends, support system, who do you confide in? Who's there to help build you up? Grow up, the statement, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. And gosh, what a lie, right? What an incredible lie. We become what we are fed. And if you are fed negativity and you are told that you are less than, even if there are parts of you that see better, it's hard to see beyond and not live in the not enough. So the emotional battle, like addiction and mental illness, domestic abuse is often, I call it the no casserole illness, right? In the South, when people are hurting, we bring food and we bring fellowship and we bring casseroles, right? You don't get that when it's domestic abuse. What goes on in your home stays in your home, or, we don't want to get involved with that. That's a personal matter. And sometimes it's unsafe to even get involved, right? So even when you're looking for the support, oftentimes it's difficult to find it and navigate it. Or even when you're looking for programs to be a part of, it's like, all right, well, you need to be a year out of your situation because we want to make sure that you're really good or that you're ready. Well, how do I get ready if there's no foundation? So there are just so many complexities, and that's just the surface. We could talk all day, even on a legal realm. There are no laws against emotional abuse or verbal abuse or financial abuse or spiritual abuse, right? So unless I have been physically abused, there are really not a lot of protections. And what we know is by the time domestic abuse escalates to a physical assault, the abuse has been going on for so long, and the damage is well beyond any black or blue bruises that you may see.
And being a longtime property manager here in Greenville myself before I switched over and became on the supplier side, I saw it. And I saw it in the very young renters. It ran the gamut. And sometimes we know before even their family knows because we're in their homes. And our listener base is from all over the United States, lots of property management folks here. It's so tough when that phone rings. And when you've been doing it a while, if it's one of your staff and not you that answers the phone, you can kind of tell what's going on, like just because of the questions. And they'll like for me, my team would put me on the phone. And I remember one day in particular, getting a phone call, and this resident was expecting, and trigger warning, and talk about a specific situation of abuse. And if anyone needs to click away for about a minute, feel free to do so, because I don't want to trigger anyone here. But the phone rang, and I had apartments that backed up, and it was the girl on this side. And she said, Katie, he's beating the brakes off of her. I can hear it right now. And if you don't train your team in how to deal with these situations, and I'm not saying my company didn't, but your heart will take over before your head. Because me, Catherine Elizabeth, took off running to apartment, whatever. What was I going to do? Like, I took off running, your adrenaline kicks in, and you're like, oh, I can't believe this. She's pregnant. What in the world is he doing? And so I go down and get in my car, run to my car, drive down to that apartment. And then I stop and I said, I need to call 911. That's, it took me a hot minute though. If it had been right there by my office, I would have probably gotten to the unit and further, talk about liability. My company would have probably been like, you wouldn't give me your keys. But if you don't train your team for these type of things, and our firm does offer educational opportunities every October in every market in which we practice to train those teams, because if you don't know what to do and to let the authorities handle it, and then contact legal, because when that person or either party comes into the office and wants to know, like, hey, we're both on this lease agreement, what are we supposed to do? Because there's nothing in the law. Like, what would you say a change in the law, like how would a change in the law make housing and relocating easier for survivors?
It gives them black and white. Right now, things are so gray and so much is at the discretion, of the property owner. And certainly I understand, both ends of the pendulum, but many times what it comes down to is like life or death, right? Like if I'm not able to leave, and I'm not even talking life or death just in a physical sense, but like in a financial sense, in terms of stability, there's so many different consequences. So I think laws take out some of the guesswork between a property owner and a survivor. It provides some clarity. It provides some protections and it provides some guidance, because without those things, you're fumbling. And when you're in a crisis, it's really hard to come up with a plan, right? So if we can get a plan beforehand, it makes it a lot easier for everyone else. And ultimately, some laws, especially around housing legislation and survivors, can open the doors for so many things. We know that survivors of domestic abuse oftentimes face eviction rates at much higher rates, than others. And it's not because of their ability or lack paying rent. It is because of the dynamics of power and control that exists within relationships where domestic abuse, is occurring. So oftentimes, victims take on the financial consequences as a means of punishment. And then it prevents them from being able to move forward and find safe and affordable housing, which makes it impossible many times to leave.
And I know you guys were a big proponent in the domestic violence and rental properties legislation that we tried so hard to get passed last session for South Carolina. And, I'll let y'all know, I think it's House Bill 3568. I'll have to recheck that. But it's been reintroduced here in South Carolina. Representative Mark Smith from the Low Country has introduced it. And we're hoping that this year we can get that passed. And it's so necessary. It would provide, like you said, that black and white, that clear cut way, like steps of how to let this person out of their lease agreement and allow them to go to safety. And I'll say, as a property manager, that is going to be just instrumental in making sure that, of course, they're following the law, because there's so much misconception out there on what you can or can't do. I know, and you have to be careful of what a relationship looks like and what those household, because they may look like me and you, but they may be a couple.
Absolutely.
You can't assume. And I've had friends in the industry who've said, just venting, talking, oh, these people keep fighting. I'm going to send them an eviction notice and a noise complaint. And I'm like, no, you're not. No, you're not. And you're not going to evict a victim. What are you thinking? And you can
Absolutely.
have those conversations. And I know our firm, this is information, not advice, so obviously not an attorney, but if we're looking at a case and there's anything in there that looks like we're about to have a case of domestic violence, absolutely not. The attorneys are in touch to tell them we're not going to evict a victim. And that's
Absolutely.
what the president of our company, we didn't have the firm I worked for at the time. I had to call him that day and say, what do I do? I don't know what in the world to do. The advice was, don't evict a victim. If the person who's staying there can't afford it, unfortunately, those things kind of work themselves out. And I was that manager that would have the conversation on the front end of, if you can't pay me, go ahead and give me keys. Do you have family? Do you have friends? Where can you go? Because in South Carolina, and we're working on something for this too, once you have an eviction on your record,
it is hard. If not impossible. And And certainly you can find some slum landlords that will, rent to you, but it's subpar conditions. It's horrible. And for someone that has already been in an unsafe situation to now move to an unsafe situation, it causes a host of other issues, not to mention if you have children or you have vulnerable adult in your home. And it just shouldn't be up for debate. I look at even the VAWA, the federal protections, that is where they were rooted from. It was because, individuals were afraid to call for help because I'm going to lose the roof over my head. And unfortunately, there were many people who lost their lives because of that. And you should not have to make a choice between having a roof over your head and your life. I mean, that should be more black and white than what it is, now. So we need those laws. And I hope that everyone will get involved, even if you don't understand the issue of domestic abuse, but understanding that safe and affordable, housing should be a basic right for all individuals. I hope we can at least agree upon that.
For sure. And if folks are in South Carolina and they would like to support this legislation, they can go to SC. If they don't know off the top of their head who their representative or senator are, they can go to scstatehouse.gov and they can type in, it has a Find Your Legislator tab, and you can send them a message right there asking them to support the Domestic Violence and Rental Housing Act that has been introduced. And we had one senator that held it up last year. And in South Carolina, that's the way it works. If one person puts their name on the bill, it's gone. It is gone. And we are still trying desperately to meet with that senator. We've tried over and over and almost to the point where it's like we get the hint. He doesn't want to talk to us. But we have an audience of one there. And I would welcome that conversation to, if there's amendments that need to be made, we can go back and forth on this, because with the statistics, 1 in 4 people are.
Absolutely.
He knows somebody that knows
And
somebody.
we know that district is not immune. There are survivors, and victims in that district that are struggling with this very, issue. And it's not about trying to stick a landlord and, not having people pay for property damages and things of that nature. We're talking about life. And it's actually sometimes a lot easier to keep the person in the unit than to evict them from the unit. As an agency, it is easier for us to help a victim that already has housing than to start over from scratch. That is a more expensive pathway. So I think it's just education is huge, right? And our assumptions are not always valid. So understanding, the true prevalence of the issue, the impact, and discussing the pathways. And it's not like it's a new thing. I mean, you look at federal protections, you look at other states, they've been successful in doing this. There's a lot of history behind this type of legislation.
And we, as a landlord association, have gotten with representatives from all over the state to see what we can do about this. And we've even met, I think you were on the call too, with the folks from Louisiana. And their bill was even more. Like, there's opportunity here because we have so little that's on the books. And so there's nothing but opportunity in our state. And we end up passing 63, 64 bills a year. So if we can just stop the infighting, some of it, and they can get the work done this year, if they want to have a career in politics that they can hang their hat on, now's their opportunity. This has the ability to change people's lives in a state that is one of the highest in the nation. That's not something they should be proud of.
Absolutely.
If you're not part of the solution, what are you?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And the correlations are there.
There really are. And thank God for organizations and like Safe Harbor. I'm sure listeners have no idea what all are the services. What services are there to the community? What way do they help support those that are survivors?
We offer a blanket of services because we recognize that many survivors and victims are just in different places. So I'll start there. We are not just for people that are leaving abusive relationships. If you're just uncertain, if you're in an abusive relationship, if you know that you're in an abusive relationship and maybe you're not ready, to leave, but you'd like some guidance, or maybe you're at the place of leaving and you need help in navigating next steps, then we're there for you. Of course, we are widely known for our emergency intervention services. We operate 3 shelters here in upstate South Carolina. Our shelters are for women and children that are fleeing, imminent danger due to domestic abuse. But we also run a hotel program, and through our hotel program, we're also able to shelter individuals that identify as male or maybe gender expansive. So we have the sheltering program. And the hotel program is identical to the emergency shelter. It just, you're placed in a hotel and then you have a team that works with you there. But through our shelter program, we're able to provide all basic needs. We do extensive case management in terms of next steps, for victims and their children. We also have a very robust community services program where we offer assistance with orders of protections, as well as counseling, case management, and advocacy for those that may be in any of the buckets, that I mentioned earlier. We also offer support groups, and educational classes. We have an education program that not only targets schools, but also just targets different places in the community around, just education of what healthy relationship looks like, which I think is so very important. A lot of times people say, well, gosh, why don't they just do better? Or why don't they just leave? Or surely they know this isn't healthy. When you've never seen healthy, there's no comparison point, right? And so we start that conversation with our education program of, what is a healthy relationship and how do you know when, things are not healthy or they're becoming toxic, and what are some of your options? So I'm particularly proud of the work that we do not only in schools, but in the community in that area, because that is where the change happens, right? Shelter is intervention, education is prevention. And then we do a lot of outreach in the community as well. We have multiple housing programs, generally for clients that are being served, a safe harbor or within our continuum. We have a rapid rehousing program in addition to a more robust housing assistance program where we're able to provide assistance for survivors for up to 2 years. So we offer the full gamut, of services.
And that's amazing. That's something I didn't realize until, as far as the peer-to-peer relationships, that it starts early, that you guys have a program that goes into the schools and talks to the children about what healthy friendships look like, because those are often our first relationships. A friendship is a relationship.
Absolutely. Our target audience, is middle school. It's called the Relationship Education Project, but we also do a lot of work, the high schools throughout the upstate. And we're hoping in 2025 to really offer early education, curriculum for elementary schools, because based upon, the data from that program, by the time an individual gets to 8th grade, there's already been some type of encounter with an abusive partner, which was startling, for us. I mean, it may not always be, in the physical sense, but in they control my phone or with social media. So if we're waiting until kids are 16 and 17 and having the conversation, then it's too late. We've got to start early. So we're really pushing, for early elementary, program and to continue to do the work, in the middle school and high schools.
That's going to be just instrumental in the future, because so much, like those of us like myself, I'm 41, we didn't grow up, I didn't have a cell phone until college. So these younger folks that have cell phones, and then they have a friend or a partner that becomes particularly obsessive about something that they ain't paying for, first and foremost. Mm-hmm. But they become obsessed about it, and they have to learn boundaries. I think that's a key is where those boundaries lie within those relationships. And if it's not brought to their attention, they're going to quickly form these habits that are going to carry over into adulthood. And then the toxicity, it follows them. And us as, we don't like to use the word landlord. It's more like housing providers. It comes to our doorstep, and you see, and like I said, the folks that I had, they were barely old enough to be on a lease agreement. And I can only imagine, and that was just one story of many over the years, but what would have been a difference, or what a difference could have been made if they had those programs where they weren't from this area, they were from Florida. What would have happened differently if they had those in place? Because the survivor came into my office and said she needed to call her mom. So I shut her in the assistant manager's door in her office. I shut that door, and then the phone rang. So I answered it, and it was her abuser. And he said, "Why is she calling me?" He said, "We have a restraining order protection." She had already gotten that. The victim's advocate had helped her with paperwork. And I was shocked that she was supposed to be calling her mom, but she called her abuser.
And that happens a lot, and with social media, and all the technology advances that were intended to make things great, they've made it so much more complex for those that abuse, and those that are survivors. And you're certainly seeing that at earlier ages where you get on Facebook or Instagram and every second of everybody's life is now turned into a reel, right? Where you're like handing out air tags to your friends because you think it's cool to keep up with each other, but is there balance? What does that look like? Or with, your cell phones and things of that nature and just the technology age, it looks so very different. And there are not laws against that. I mean, reality is South Carolina has no protections for dating violence. So even when situations are extreme, there are very few things or very few options that a victim has.
That has to be so challenging for you guys. What other challenges, other than like technology and lack of law providing protections, what other challenges are you seeing as a housing navigator and advocate?
Well, availability and funding, I think that's always going to be at the top. I think post-COVID, the housing market is just completely different and it changed the landscape. And while that may have been advantageous to others, it certainly has been very difficult and very challenging, for survivors, with rent now being 2 and 3 times, higher than it was, 5 to 7 years ago. It is sometimes impossible to find, something that is affordable, which is why being able to hold on to their homes is so very important. So that accessibility is huge. And then even if you find something that's affordable, is it in a safe area? And so that challenge. So just the scarcity, affordable housing or housing that is central to jobs and healthcare and all the basic things that you need if you do not have, transportation. So a lot of times we're finding, if you can call it affordable housing in, the outlying areas, of counties, but then victims can't get to work. They can't get their kids to the places that they need to be. And so that becomes, more of a challenge as well. And then, of course, funding. We have seen a steady decline in funding over the last few years, and it doesn't look like it's going to get better. We are certainly going into a year of much, uncertainty. And so funding also will be jeopardized. And so just recognizing that the need is so great, but the resources, are so few. And so how do you even begin to scratch, the surface? Which is why I say often we do great work at Safe Harbor, and I'm proud to be a part of an organization that is so impactful in the community, but we're not the answer to solving domestic abuse. It has to be a community approach. I work a lot of hours and it's never enough. It'll never be enough. It's going to take all of us, and we have to be able to diversify our resources. We have to bring different people to the table and look at different pathways, because the issue is not going away. It's growing and it's looking different. And pre-pandemic, like I said, I've been doing this work for 16 years. I've never seen as many high lethalities as I've seen within, the last 3 or 4 years, as I've had in my entire career. Something changed, COVID, staying home and isolating, all the things that we were told to do to buckle down and stay safe really was the seedbed, for mass disaster for victims of domestic abuse. And we are just beginning to see the true impact, and rippling effects of that, not only to survivors, but I think in just communities. So I think there's still a lot of uncertainty and just exhaustion.
And with funding, it's so shocking to me. And it just, again, as we were shaking my head earlier over our lack of laws in our state, but one would think that in a state where this is such a prevalent issue, that there would be more funding, more grants that would be available to nonprofits who are actively working in that space. And it's just not the case. I'm shocked to hear that. Do you guys get grants other than, I know that At the Table, which we weren't able to have this year due to Hurricane Helene? And I so hated that, because I know, what does that event mean to Safe Harbor? How how instrumental is that in the overall success of the organization?
It's very instrumental. I think not just from a financial, position, because it does help us raise money, for our services, but it's also an opportunity to bring those in our community and have the discussion, and that education and that engagement, was so very important. So we were so sad that was something that we were not able to offer because of Helene, this year, but I'm hopeful that we'll be able to offer that in 2025 because it is fundamental. But I also believe, Katie, that we cannot wait to those types of events to come to the table. We have to come to the table every day, even when it's tables that we don't agree, or even, when it's tables where, I want to sit at this end and not that end. Like, we got to be able to have these tough conversations, and we've got to be able to find collaborative solutions, because that is where the healing lies. I believe that it just has to be an ongoing conversation and an ongoing, level of engagement.
And what are the current needs of Safe Harbor? What if, I know, like with our firm, we are offered opportunities to volunteer. And there's another form going around like, hey, there's some more opportunities in the coming weeks to go into, whether it's cleaning bathrooms or organizing. What are the current needs, and how can listeners get involved if they feel led to help the cause?
Of course, finances are always at the heart, of needs, right? So, of course, there is an overwhelming need just for finances with the building of the new shelter, with the demand and increase, for services, with the uncertainty of the new administration and upcoming budgets. We're just not sure how we're going to fare. So financial support and being able to diversify funding is huge, for us right now. But we also need volunteers, and those can look different depending upon, your area. We need landlords that are going to work with us, in the area of housing. That is huge, that are going to come and initiate, those types of collaborations as well. But, we also need ambassadors, in our community who are willing to go out and talk about domestic abuse and the mission of Safe Harbor, especially, if you are a survivor of domestic abuse, or if you've championed or walked, with a loved one, throughout their journey. We need all of those people, at the table. Certainly we have volunteer needs in terms of childcare. We have all kinds of, different shelter projects, that are always going on that we can always use assistance with, tabling events, different things, of that nature.
That's a call to action for landlords. This is something that the founding principal of our firm and I have talked about, that he came to Safe Harbor, if I'm not mistaken, and said, maybe see if you can find some landlords. And it may have to be a mom and pop. It may not be, I won't name a management company on here, obviously, but it can't be big name management company LLC. It may have to be a mom and pop, or a single family property management company that would be willing to potentially, maybe not always, but relax their criteria a little bit, because we haven't talked about this yet, but I mean, the criminality, like a person who was a survivor may have caught a charge from defending themselves. And I remember hearing in South Carolina, and I should know this, but I don't off the top of my head, if the police are called, do they always take both parties to jail now, or do you know, or is it one party?
Well, with the law has changed, there's this list of factors that they're supposed to look at, and then they make a decision. It does not mean that someone's going to be arrested, but many times the person that's arrested is not the person, that has initiated the harm. That's especially true in communities of color. So the complexities of even involving the law enforcement for those reasons can be very difficult, for a survivor. Because oftentimes those that cause harm, they are well put together, they're calculated, like in their approach. And because of the gaslighting, because of the power and control, manipulation is at the heart of what they do. So oftentimes when law enforcement comes on the scene, the victim may look erratic. The victim may look as if they're the one out of control. But you have to look at the entire picture and being able to have the conversations and take the deeper dive to see exactly, what's going on.
I've read a lot, and of course, it might go away in a few weeks, but TikTok about reactive abuse, that person, and we talked a little bit about this off camera too, that they're often narcissists. they're often in that discard phase where they don't care about that person anymore, but there's some sort of entertainment value that they seek that is totally demented. But they know that if I push this button, this person's going to react this way. And I've seen, it was a show on Netflix about my crazy ex or something. And he's 16, but I had my son watch it with me. Because I'm like, look, I need you to know that this is
what's out there.
Yeah, this is happening, and have those conversations at home, because eventually, they grow up and they get into relationships too. But back to the landlords, if they're willing, because that person may have gotten a charge because of a reactive abuse situation, but if they just sat down with that person, of course, abiding by fair housing laws, but were willing to relax some criteria, and of course, the goal, of course, cheaper to keep the person in their current home. But if they needed to be rehoused and looking for landlords to participate, if there's an option to reduce or relax some criteria to allow someone to have a new start, that's the good stuff.
Yeah, and that is huge, and it provides such a level of stability, which is how people start over. That's how you get back on your feet. Leaving is not how you get on your feet. Leaving opens the door, right? But it's the stability piece, that really takes you to surviving, from just surviving to thriving.
And again, I hope that At the Table luncheon can take place next year. It was great last year having Maggie Nichols and seeing her story. Of course, growing up, I followed gymnastics and was in all the things, dance, tap, gymnastics growing up, and just hearing her story and the other survivors throughout the years. I think I've gone to about 4 now. And just hearing the stories.
They're so powerful.
Yes, it is. There's nary a dry eye in the room, because if you have a heart, you're moved to tears by
Absolutely
the strength of these individuals. And like we've talked about, statistically speaking, we all know one. Statistically speaking, we do. And
absolutely,
it's such a heavy topic. And this week we've talked about it being the holidays. What specific challenges are those that are still in abusive relationships facing during the holidays, when some of us are just going along our merry way and not thinking that there are people out there among us that the holidays aren't so holly jolly?
Absolutely. I mean, I think in addition to the everyday, struggles, the normality of life is often disrupted, during the holidays. I said yesterday, gosh, my days are running together. I don't know what day it is because I've been off, for the last week or so. But there is so much normality to kids being able to go to school, to individuals being able to go to work, right? Even when home is unsafe, there are outlets. And during the holidays, many of those outlets are diminished, right? So people are off work, the kids are out of school, everyone's in the house together. So the tension is often higher. If you have things like addiction, that are present in your home, oftentimes isolation, can be a seedbed, for those things to intensify. Also, just the seasons changing, right? Oftentimes that can feed into someone's mental health or to their mood, altogether, or the financial pressures, everyone's tree is not full of, presents, and it's this joyous time. It can be very difficult, financially and emotionally. And so all that additional stress, in the house can oftentimes intensify, domestic abuse, situations. And then when everything is closed because it's the holiday, so I'm not going to the doctor to see hey, what's going on, or an outlet. Oh, you're going to be home for 3 days, so no one's going to see you. So those 3 days can look very different versus if I'm having interfacing, every day. So I think all of those things can make conditions even more unsafe, for a survivor as well. I also think around this time of year, it's so easy to get caught up in your own thing and in the day to day that you don't see people in the way that we need to see people. So it can be easy to overlook, those that are struggling, as well. Grief and loss, even if you've left a relationship that was unhealthy or, unsafe for you, it was still a relationship, right? And there's still an attachment there. So now I'm in a shelter, I'm uncertain about housing or my next steps, and I'm longing for family, I'm longing for connection. Those are real emotions, right? Regardless of what you've experienced in your life. And those things can be very difficult. And so many times you'll see survivors survivors even go back during this time, of year as well. A lot of times it's more the stake of, okay, it's the holidays, things are going to get better. It's a happy time. I'm going to do everything I can, to make sure that things are okay. Well, for the person that is enduring the abuse, the ability to do that is not on you because you don't have the ability to control that narrative. But you try so very hard, and then when things don't happen the way that you want them to, it's dealing with the letdown, of that. So here I am at the end of another year going into a new year with the same old can be very difficult. So I think it's so important for us to be mindful that holidays and any day, honestly, can be very difficult for folks. But oftentimes the seasons that bring us the most joy can bring the most hardship for others around us.
Being a property manager, this time of year, and during COVID too, the noise complaints and the disturbances, the phone calls to either the management office during the business day or to even a courtesy officer after hours, I saw an increase. So I never saw a direct correlation between abuse, because sometimes people don't say what it is. They said they're being loud next door. Can you make them be quiet? That kind of thing. But now being on this side, interesting. I don't think I've ever, I'm assuming I'm okay to say this. I've never seen a case for noise complaints. I've never seen someone get evicted because it's so hard to prove, but it's so important to say something, because if you're living in an apartment community and you're hearing something that sounds not right, both people sometimes are home. Like we often have, this is when a lot of folks either have PTO that they're taking, or if they're fortunate enough to work for an organization that gives you time off this time of the year, more people are at home, and it's just more of an opportunity for that person to be around the abuser and no outlet, and that phone starts ringing, knowing what to do next. And just like we talked about, having a plan in place, whether you're a property manager, just the whole team needs to be on top of it at all times, but especially during the holidays, because don't take for granted that, that loud voice isn't someone that's being abused. I would always ask, what does it sound like? Can you hear what they're saying? Are you just hearing voices? Or are you hearing things being thrown around? What is it that you're hearing? Because then, they've put it on me, and now the ball's in my court as a manager.
Absolutely.
What to do. And oftentimes they don't go over that in new hire orientation.
Not at all.
It's not something that you go over, and you have to practice what to do. Or like I said earlier, your heart will take over before your head, and then you could inadvertently put yourself in harm's way. And we talked a little bit too off camera of the reluctance about calling the police, because, oh, you called the police? You called somebody? Oh, really? And that kind of thing, it could kind of exacerbate the situation in those cases. It's just a time of year to be mindful of what those phone calls mean and what really might be going on the other end of that phone.
Absolutely. And sometimes just reaching out and checking on people as well. Like when you haven't heard from someone, because again, work, school, they all provide respites. And so a lot of times during the holidays, we'll actually see our call volume go down because of accessibility. Like, okay, I can't call and get help at work, or I'm at home with the abusive partner, so it's not safe for me to call. And then right after the holidays, we will see our call volume shoot way up because people have been isolated and these things have been going on, over the holidays. So I think being aware of that, from both ends. And I think a lot of times we just assume, oh, people need us, or if they need help, they'll call for help. But unfortunately, with survivors of domestic abuse, it is just not always that easy. Many times, even in situations where maybe law enforcement has been at the home several times and they've been tagged as a frequent caller. And so their calls are not taken seriously, or they're afraid. They've been told, if law enforcement comes out here one more time, then we're going to have to look at your lease because it's becoming a nuisance, and so I'm afraid, okay, if something happens, or if law enforcement comes out because, it's loud, they suspect fighting, then they're going to have to also call DSS. And now I'm worried about, a DSS, charge with my kids, and am I going to be able to take care of my kids? All of those things are very difficult. Or the person, now that we're all in the same house and they're controlling access to food and transportation and things of that nature, it can be very difficult at best.
Yeah. And sometimes you'll notice some red flags, even during the leasing process. I was really good at figuring out who the decision maker was when you have a group of people, because as a leasing consultant, who am I selling to? And if it's, we've probably all, if you've been doing it long enough, had that person. It's not always a male-female dynamic, but where they're yielding to that other person. I'm sure these aren't like statistics, but these are just things that I noticed whenever I was on site for 20 years, when you had someone that would yield to that other person, where even sometimes they'd bring them in after they would lease, and that person is not on the lease agreement. So technically you're not supposed to talk to them, but it's obvious who's wearing the pants, so to speak. And that could be, just make a little mental note, because I hesitate against marking anything in their file about it for many reasons, but just mental note. Okay, this person seems to yield to that person, but they're the financially responsible party. And it might be a little clue that there's more here to the story, because that coercive control is very real and it's covert.
Absolutely.
You don't sometimes realize you've yielded control until after it's already done. And then it's so hard to walk that back and try to get that control or switch that. I don't hate to say power dynamic, because in a relationship, I don't think there shouldn't be power, but to switch that dynamic back to where it's more of an even playing field.
Absolutely. And Katie, that's why legislation is so important, right? Because it takes the guesswork out of a lot of that, because you're able to say, all right, these are your rights as a tenant. This is your right as a co-tenant. This is what happens in this situation. This is what a grievance process looks like. Being able to have some policies, even if you're an independent landlord, to say, hey, this is what we do here. This is the procedure for that. That is so important for a survivor to know, because you only know what you know. And oftentimes when you are in crisis, you function in crisis. So you are just trying to make it day by day. So it's so difficult to see beyond that. But when you're educated on what your options are, that is often a game changer for folks.
And it makes you, as a housing provider, less anxious and more confident in handling those situations, because renting, moving, I used to tell folks, if you're lucky, you only move a couple times in your life. It's, statistically speaking, one of the most stressful times in someone's life. And I felt so comfortable, because I was like, look, y'all may have to do this 1 or 2 times in your life, probably a few more if you're lucky, but I've chosen to do this with my career. If I'm not nervous, I don't want you to be nervous. I want housing providers in South Carolina to have that same level of confidence in speaking about issues surrounding domestic abuse and what the options are to break a lease, to have someone removed from the lease agreement, have the abuser or if the survivor wants to be removed. I want there to be a clear-cut way for them to say, hey, you've come to me with this issue. I'm here to help you. This is what it is, and lay it out. Because like you said, right now, other than VAWA, and that's not for conventional properties, and that's not
right.
What the majority of properties in South Carolina are. They're more conventional than affordable or LIHTC or Section 8, but VAWA does not apply to conventional properties. So
absolutely,
we've got to get this passed. And it's something that once it does happen, I'm sure our firm, as well as the state of South Carolina's Apartment Association, would provide education, as well as like you guys with Safe Harbor, and then my sister's house down in Charleston could provide that education piece so that housing providers and survivors alike know what the options are and can truly be confident in providing those answers. Because I felt like Elmer Fudd, when they would come in, because I didn't know. I had no idea. And until it happens to you and you've dealt with it once, then you kind of know. But every situation is unique. And
absolutely.
If we had one set of laws, that would be beneficial. And
it wouldn't solve everything, but it sure would make a lot of things better.
Yes. And we've got some help too. I think I mentioned to you guys a couple weeks ago that when the bill was introduced, I reached out to United States Representative Congresswoman Nancy Mace. She's Nancy's District 1, District 3. I should know this, but Nancy's down there in the Low Country. And when we met with her about the housing choice voucher bill earlier this year, she'd mentioned being a survivor. And I was like, wow, this surpasses all socioeconomic statuses. You would never know. And I've had public officials, I've had the gamut over my 20-year career discuss this issue. But having someone like her who's been through it and knows that this bill has been introduced and is willing to help us provide whatever pressure she can from the federal level will be beneficial. And I'm hoping to get our Congressman, William Timmons from our area, on board here too, to see if he can give some push, because that push is coming from the district here in South Carolina that's in the upstate. It's in our area. And if we have that audience of one working to overcome whatever objections, which I think it was the red flag laws, he couldn't quite remember, but we've sent the legislation over to him for review. And this might be a little forward, but if you could say anything to that person who's in opposition, what would it be?
Imagine if it was someone that you love. I think we have to humanize, issues like domestic abuse. We have to look beyond the other people or what you think. The stereotypical, survivor or victim looks like. If this was your daughter or your son or your mother, what would be your approach? What would you want to see happen? Because I think when we can humanize an issue, if we can make it personal, because like you said earlier, and we said over and over again, just like this career path is not something that I believe you just choose. It's something that chooses you. No one goes out and chooses to be like a survivor or a victim, right? I don't wake up and say, you know what, let me find the worst person to have the worst relationship and have the worst outcomes, because at the end of the day, I want to be in the worst situation. That's never the goal of any beginning, right? Even on our worst days, right? And so I think that that's what's important for people to realize. It isn't a choice. It isn't a decision. People stay because they don't see other options, not because they feel it's the best decision.
There's nothing but opportunity here, and we're ready to just roll them up.
Absolutely.
Let's get ready for this next legislative session and see what we can get passed, because it does take awareness and education like what we're doing here today to inform the general population, the general public, of these issues that are going on, that there are absolutely organizations out there that are willing to help, but that they also have needs that can be filled by the public. And that I'm assuming that there's training and things of that nature. If you want to get involved, if you feel so called, is the best way to reach you guys through the website or through email?
Yep, absolutely.
Is it Safe Harbor?
Yes, it is. safeharbor.org.
So safeharbor.sc.org. If listeners, if you feel so led, please reach out and support organizations like Safe Harbor if you're in this area, or even if you're not. They need our help. It's going to take the collaboration of organizations, awareness, education, all of us coming to the table to have what we said are going to be very difficult and uncomfortable conversations. But that's where the magic happens. That's where we realize that we're not all as different as we may seem, that we have a lot in common, and there's a lot of opportunity to leave people's places and spaces better than we found them.
Absolutely. And you don't have to understand the complete issue, to believe that people deserve options. And I think too, if someone needs assistance, know that we are available. We have a 24/7, helpline. That number is 1-800-291-2139. So if you are in need of services, or someone that's in need of services, please reach out to us.
And I always like to end my podcast with, on a high note, a light note there. I'm a huge music lover, and I always like to ask my guests, what is their favorite song, if they have one, and why?
So I'm a music lover as well, and that is such a loaded question, because there's so many good songs. So I'm not going to pick one song, but I will tell you my top artists right now. I really love Lizzo, and I love Beyonce. I so enjoyed the Beyonce Bowl. But I'm big, of course, on women's empowerment and just being your authentic self. And their music speaks to that in so many different ways. And so, they're certainly my top choices.
Yeah, and I know the Bayhive is going to be out there getting
Yes.
information.
Absolutely, for the big announcement, whatever it may be.
I know. I'm looking forward to that myself. I've obviously followed Beyonce since Destiny's Child and a huge Destiny's Child fan from back in the day when MTV was all the rage. And we've seen her career and see her grow, and artists like Lizzo that are continuing to, I mean, she plays the flute. Like,
yes. And just the body positivity,
yes.
I think, you know, like around that. And yeah, like it's okay to live your truth. I think that is the message that I hope, you know, to share with my own life. And so I certainly resonate with that type of music.
For sure. And music makes everything a bit better, and it's so important. And I just want to thank you again, Michelle, for joining me on today's episode.
Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. You're welcome. And I look forward to continuing the conversation. I know we'll be working together through the Homeless Alliance and through our collaborative advocacy for the domestic violence and rental housing bill.
Absolutely. I'm looking forward to it.
All right, everyone. Have a great day. And that's a wrap on today's episode of The Real Spill, a podcast where I spill on all things multifamily advocacy and how we as industry professionals can work together with our elected officials, stakeholders, and allies to bring about change for the rental housing industry. Thank you for joining me. I hope you've learned something new. Now, go be a voice. Until next time, Spills out.